deep in the steaming jungles of the Southwest Pacific, where mountains rise like ancient giants and rivers carve through landscapes so wild that no map could truly capture their fury. A war unfolded that would test the limits of human endurance and reshape the destiny of nations. This is the story of the New Guinea Campaign, a battle that stretched across nearly 3 years of unimaginable horror, heroism, and sacrifice. Here, in a land where nature itself seemed to wage war against anyone foolish enough to enter, soldiers from opposite sides of the world clashed in what would become one of the longest and most brutal campaigns of the Second World War. The jungle consumed armies whole, diseases killed more men than bullets, and the very ground beneath their feet became an enemy as dangerous as any human foe. From the desperate defense of Port Moresby to the final Allied victory that broke Japanese power in the Pacific, this is the complete story of how a forgotten island became the graveyard of empires and the birthplace of legends. This is the story of courage tested beyond all limits, of strategies that changed warfare forever, and of ordinary men who faced extraordinary evil in a place where death wore 1,000 different faces. The tale of New Guinea begins not with the first shot fired, but with understanding why this massive island, second largest in the world, suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific theater. Before the war, New Guinea was a place most people had never heard of, a mysterious land split between Dutch control in the west and Australian administration in the east. The island stretched over 1,500 miles from end to end, covered in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Massive mountain ranges soared to heights of over 13,000 feet, their peaks shrouded in mist and their slopes thick with rainforests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Rivers churned through valleys with violent force, and swamps stretched for miles, breeding grounds for mosquitoes that carried malaria and dengue fever. The native people had lived in these lands for thousands of years, adapted to an environment that seemed determined to kill anyone else who tried to survive there. But when Japan began its rapid expansion across the Pacific in early 1942, New Guinea suddenly transformed from an obscure colonial backwater into a strategic prize of immense value. The Japanese understood that controlling New Guinea would give them a launching point to attack Australia itself, cutting off Allied supply lines and potentially forcing the Australians out of the war entirely. For the Allies, particularly Australia, defending New Guinea became a matter of national survival. If the Japanese secured the island, Australian cities would be within easy striking distance of enemy bombers and invasion forces. The campaign truly began in January 1942 when Japanese forces captured Rabaul on the island of New Britain, just east of New Guinea. This gave them a powerful base from which to launch further operations. The speed and ferocity of Japanese expansion had already shocked the world. They had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, taken Singapore, and swept through the Dutch East Indies with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Their soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and motivated by a warrior code that accepted death as preferable to surrender. Their commanders believed they were invincible, that their string of victories would continue unbroken until they controlled the entire Pacific. In March 1942, Japanese forces landed on the northern coast of New Guinea, quickly seizing the towns of Lee and Salamaua. These weren't just random conquests, but carefully chosen positions that would serve as stepping stones toward their ultimate goal of Port Moresby, the capital of Australian Papua on the southern coast. If Port Moresby fell, Australia's northern approaches would be exposed, and the entire strategic situation in the Pacific would shift dramatically in Japan's favor. The Japanese High Command began planning a complex operation that would involve both a seaborne invasion of Port Moresby and an overland advance across the seemingly impassable Owen-Stanley mountain range that formed New Guinea's spine. The first major confrontation came not on land, but at sea during the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942. This naval engagement was unlike any that had come before because the opposing fleets never actually saw each other. Instead, aircraft carriers launched planes that did all the fighting, a new kind of warfare that would define Pacific combat. The Japanese intended to land troops at Port Moresby from the sea, but American and Australian naval forces intercepted them. The battle lasted several days and resulted in significant losses on both sides. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, and the Yorktown was damaged. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and saw the large carrier Shikaku damaged. More importantly, the invasion force turned back. For the first time since the war began, a major Japanese offensive had been stopped. This tactical setback forced the Japanese to reconsider their strategy. If they couldn't take Port Moresby by sea, they would have to take it by land, which meant crossing the Owen-Stanley Range along a narrow track that would become infamous as the Kokoda Track. The Kokoda Track was not a road or even a proper trail, but rather a footpath that had been used for generations by native people moving between the northern and southern coasts of Papua. It stretched about 60 miles as the crow flies, but covered over 90 miles of actual walking distance due to its constant climbing and descending. The track rose and fell over mountain ridges, crossed swift rivers on precarious log bridges, and wound through jungle so thick that men often couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. In some places, the trail became so steep that troops had to pull themselves up using tree roots and vines. The climate added another layer of misery. Temperatures could be sweltering during the day and surprisingly cold at night in the higher elevations. Rain fell almost constantly, turning the track into a river of mud that sucked at boots and made every step an exhausting struggle. This was the route the Japanese chose to advance toward Port Moresby, and this was where Australian forces would make their stand in what would become one of the most grueling infantry campaigns of the entire war. Japanese forces began their overland advance in July 1942. They landed more troops at Gona and Buna on the northern coast and began pushing south along the Kokoda Track. The initial Australian defenders were members of the 39th Battalion, a militia unit composed largely of young men with minimal training. These soldiers had expected to serve in garrison duty, not face the elite Japanese South Seas Force, veterans of campaigns across Asia. The Australians were outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared for the ferocity of Japanese tactics. The enemy didn't just attack, they seemed to flow through the jungle like water, appearing where they shouldn't be able to, surrounding positions, and attacking with such determination that they would charge into machine gun fire without hesitation. The fighting was intimate and brutal. Men fired at each other from distances so close they could see their enemies' faces. Grenades were thrown back and forth. Bayonets and knives became weapons of necessity when ammunition ran low, or when opposing soldiers stumbled into each other in the thick undergrowth. The Australians fought a desperate fighting withdrawal, contesting every ridge and village along the track. At places with names that would become sacred in Australian military history like Isarava, Ayera Creek, Templeton's Crossing, and Brigade Hill, small groups of defenders held up the Japanese advance for days at a time before being forced to fall back. The Japanese pushed forward relentlessly, driven by their orders to take Port Moresby and their belief in their own superiority. By early September, they had advanced to within 30 miles of Port Moresby and could actually see the lights of the town from the mountains. Australian commanders feared that the capital would fall and that nothing could stop the Japanese momentum. But several factors were working against the Japanese that they didn't fully appreciate. First, their supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Every bullet, every grain of rice, every piece of equipment had to be carried by hand over that same terrible track they had just traversed. Second, they were beginning to suffer from the same diseases and exhaustion that plagued everyone in New Guinea. Third, and most crucially, Allied forces were building up strength around Port Moresby, bringing in fresh troops and supplies by air and sea. The Japanese advance ground to a halt not because they were defeated in battle, but because they simply could not sustain their offensive. Their soldiers were starving, sick with malaria and dysentery, and cut off from reinforcement. Meanwhile, Australian forces were being reinforced with experienced units like the 21st and 25th Brigades, veterans who had fought in North Africa. American forces were also entering the campaign in significant numbers. The decision was made to launch a counteroffensive, to push the Japanese back along the same track they had advanced on, and to eliminate their presence from Papua entirely. What followed was a nightmare for both sides. The Australians and Americans now had to advance up and over the Owen-Stanley Range, fighting the Japanese who defended every position with the same fanaticism they had shown on the attack. The Japanese soldiers, taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, fought to the death even when their position was hopeless. They would hide in caves and bunkers, emerging to attack supply lines and rearguard units. They booby-trapped bodies and equipment. They fought until their ammunition was exhausted and then charged with bayonets or simply waited in their positions to die from starvation and disease. The Allied advance toward the northern coast was agonizingly slow. Troops moved forward a few hundred yards at a time, clearing bunkers and fighting through prepared defenses. The logistical challenges were enormous. Everything needed by the soldiers had to be carried forward by hand or by native carriers who performed superhuman feats of endurance. These carriers, primarily Papua New Guineans who became known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels by the Australians, carried wounded men down the mountain on stretchers, transported supplies forward, and guided lost patrols. Their contribution to the campaign cannot be overstated. Without them, the Allied advance would have been impossible. Many died from disease or Japanese attack, but they continued serving with a dedication that earned them a permanent place in the gratitude of those they helped. By November 1942, Allied forces had reached the northern coast and were preparing to assault the Japanese strongholds at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. The fighting at Buna and Gona introduced a new kind of horror to the campaign. The Japanese had constructed elaborate defensive positions using coconut logs that proved almost impervious to small arms fire and even artillery. They dug bunkers with interlocking fields of fire so that attacking one position exposed troops to fire from several others. The ground was a mix of swamp and coconut plantation, offering little cover for advancing troops. The Japanese defenders, though cut off and starving, fought with desperate courage. They knew no relief was coming and that they were doomed, but their code of Bushido demanded they fight to the last man. The battles became sieges. Allied troops, including American forces who were seeing their first sustained ground combat against the Japanese, learned brutal lessons about jungle warfare. Frontal assaults were suicidal. Flanking movements bogged down in swamps. Artillery had limited effect against the well-constructed bunkers. It took weeks of grinding combat, with troops sometimes advancing only a few yards per day, to reduce these positions. Flamethrowers and tanks were eventually brought in to deal with the bunkers, but even these powerful weapons had limited effect in the difficult terrain. Gona fell in early December 1942, but only after the Japanese garrison had been completely wiped out. Buna held until early January 1943. Sanananda, the last of the three strongpoints, didn't fall until January 22nd. The casualty rates were staggering. In some units, 70 to 80% of men became casualties from either combat wounds or disease. Malaria struck down soldiers by the thousands. Tropical ulcers, caused by minor cuts that became infected in the filthy conditions, ate through flesh down to the bone. Scrub typhus, dengue fever, and dysentery weakened men until they could barely stand. The psychological toll was equally severe. Men watched their friends die slowly from disease or suddenly from sniper fire. The constant heat, humidity, insects, and lack of proper rest pushed soldiers to their mental limits. Some units had to be withdrawn not because of battlefield losses, but because the survivors were physically and mentally incapable of continuing. With the Papuan campaign concluded, the Allied command under General Douglas MacArthur turned its attention to pushing the Japanese further back along the northern coast of New Guinea. The Japanese still held strong positions at Lee and Salamoa, the same towns they had captured back in March 1942. They also controlled the Huon Peninsula and had forces scattered throughout the interior. MacArthur's strategy was to conduct a series of amphibious landings combined with overland advances that would bypass Japanese strongpoints, cut them off from supply and reinforcement, and force them to withdraw or be annihilated. This approach, called leapfrogging or island hopping, would become the standard Allied strategy throughout the Pacific. Rather than attacking every Japanese position head-on, the Allies would use their superior naval and air power to strike at weaker points, establish new bases, and leave Japanese garrisons isolated and irrelevant to the broader campaign. The next major operation targeted Lee and Salamoa. In a coordinated offensive beginning in September 1943, Australian troops advanced overland from Wau, a small town in the interior that had been held throughout the Japanese advance. Simultaneously, amphibious landings were conducted east of Lee, while American paratroopers dropped into the Markham Valley to cut off Japanese retreat routes. This multi-pronged assault worked better than anyone had hoped. The Japanese, realizing they were being surrounded, evacuated Lee and Salamoa rather than face encirclement. However, their withdrawal through the jungle cost them thousands of men to disease, starvation, and ambush by Allied forces and native warriors who had turned against the Japanese occupiers. The success at Lee opened up new opportunities. Allied forces could now use the Markham Valley as a corridor into the interior of New Guinea. Engineers immediately began constructing airfields that would support further advances. The campaign was developing a rhythm of advance, consolidate, build airfields, and advance again. While the fighting along the coast attracted attention, Equally desperate struggles were taking place in the interior of New Guinea, often in places so remote that news of the battles took days to reach headquarters. Japanese forces had penetrated deep into the Central Highlands, seeking to disrupt Allied operations and secure resources. Small Australian units, often reinforced by native constabulary forces, conducted long-range patrols and fought actions that rarely made it into official histories, but were no less deadly for those involved. These patrols could last weeks or even months, moving through terrain that had never been mapped, crossing rivers that had no names, and climbing mountains that defeated even the strongest men. Supplies were dropped by air when weather permitted, but often patrols had to live off the land or rely on native villages for food. The isolation was complete. Radio contact was unreliable in the mountains. If men were wounded or became sick, evacuation was nearly impossible. They either recovered or died where they fell. One of these forgotten battles occurred around WWII in early 1943 when Japanese forces launched a major offensive to capture this strategic town. Australian defenders, massively outnumbered, held a perimeter that shrank each day as the Japanese closed in. The situation became so desperate that reinforcements were flown in on transport planes that landed under fire, unloaded troops, and immediately took off again. The battle hung in the balance for days, until the fresh Australian troops managed to halt the Japanese advance and then counterattack, driving the enemy back with heavy losses. This kind of action, multiplied across dozens of locations throughout New Guinea, represented the unglamorous but essential work of preventing Japanese infiltration and maintaining control over the vast interior. Intelligence gathering was another crucial aspect of these inland operations. Coast watchers, often Australian officers or colonial officials who had stayed behind when the Japanese invaded, hid in the jungle and radioed information about Japanese movements, ship positions, and troop strengths. Native scouts and guides provided invaluable local knowledge. Some Japanese prisoners were captured and interrogated, though this was rare given the Japanese preference for death over surrender. The campaign in New Guinea was not just fought on the ground, but also in the skies above. Control of the air was absolutely essential for both sides because it determined who could move troops and supplies effectively and who could support ground operations with bombing and strafing. The Japanese had started the campaign with superior aircraft and experienced pilots, but by mid-1943, the balance had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. American aircraft, particularly the P-38 Lightning fighter and B-25 Mitchell bomber, proved highly effective in the Pacific environment. Australian pilots flying American-made aircraft also contributed significantly to the air campaign. The Allies developed new tactics specifically for the New Guinea campaign. One of the most devastating was skip bombing, where B-25 bombers would fly at extremely low altitude toward Japanese ships and release their bombs to skip across the water like stones, slamming into the sides of vessels below the waterline. This tactic proved devastatingly effective during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a turning point in the air war. Japanese commanders attempted to reinforce their garrison at Lee by sending a convoy of troop transports escorted by destroyers through the Bismarck Sea. Allied reconnaissance spotted the convoy, and American and Australian aircraft launched a massive attack. Over 3 days, the Allied planes sank all 8 transports and 4 destroyers, killing thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors. The convoy was virtually annihilated. This disaster convinced the Japanese that they could no longer safely move large numbers of troops by sea in the region. They would have to rely on submarines and small craft for resupply, which meant their garrisons would slowly wither from lack of reinforcement and supplies. The air campaign also targeted Japanese airfields constantly. Allied bombers struck at Rabaul repeatedly, degrading its effectiveness as a forward base. Fighter sweeps destroyed Japanese planes on the ground and in the air. By late 1943, the Allies had achieved air superiority over most of New Guinea, allowing them to move their forces with relative freedom, while the Japanese were forced to move at night or not at all. As 1943 turned into 1944, the Allied advance along the northern coast of New Guinea accelerated. The pattern established earlier continued with amphibious landings leapfrogging over Japanese strongholds. Finschhafen fell in October 1943 after fierce fighting. The Huon Peninsula was cleared by early 1944. Each advance brought Allied airfields closer to the Philippines, which was MacArthur's ultimate objective. The Supreme Allied commander had famously promised to return to the Philippines after being evacuated from Corregidor in 1942, and everything he did in New Guinea was aimed at making that return possible. The fighting maintained its brutal character. The Japanese never gave up ground easily. Every position was defended with fanatical determination. Allied troops developed better tactics through hard experience. They learned to bypass bunkers when possible rather than assault them directly. They used artillery more effectively, calling down barrages to suppress enemy fire before advancing. Tanks, though difficult to use in the terrain, proved invaluable when they could be brought forward. Flamethrowers became standard equipment for clearing bunkers and pillboxes. The campaign also became more international in character. Australian troops continued to bear much of the fighting burden in the eastern parts of New Guinea. American forces, growing in strength as the United States industrial machine reached full production, took on larger roles. Dutch colonial forces operated in western New Guinea. Even small contingents from other allied nations participated. The native peoples of New Guinea also played increasing roles as guides, scouts, and laborers. The relationship between allied soldiers and native populations was complex. Some Papuans and New Guineans had suffered terribly under Japanese occupation, which had been brutal in many areas. Japanese forces, facing starvation themselves, had seized food from villages, forced natives into labor gangs, and sometimes massacred entire communities suspected of helping the Allies. This turned many natives against the Japanese and toward the Allied side. Other communities, particularly in more remote areas, tried to remain neutral, wanting only to survive the war that had come uninvited to their lands. In April 1944, MacArthur launched his most ambitious operation yet. Rather than continuing the slow advance along the coast, he ordered a massive amphibious assault on Hollandia, deep in the rear of Japanese positions. This leap covered nearly 500 miles, bypassing entire Japanese armies and landing Allied forces far closer to the Philippines than anyone had thought possible. The operation was a gamble. If the Japanese had been prepared, the landing force could have faced disaster. But Allied intelligence, particularly signals intelligence from code breaking, had revealed that Hollandia was weakly defended. The Japanese command had assumed that the Allies would continue their methodical advance and had concentrated their forces further east. When 3 American divisions landed at Hollandia and nearby Adape, they encountered only light resistance. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Thousands of Japanese troops fled inland, abandoning equipment and supplies. Allied forces captured 3 airfields virtually intact. The success of the Hollandia operation vindicated MacArthur's strategy and changed the nature of the New Guinea campaign. The Japanese armies that had been bypassed further east suddenly found themselves cut off. They couldn't retreat because the Allies controlled the coast behind them. They couldn't be supplied adequately by sea or air because Allied forces dominated both. They became what the Japanese called hungry armies, garrisons that slowly starved and withered while remaining combat effective enough to tie down Allied troops who had to watch them. This was exactly what MacArthur wanted. By bypassing these forces, he avoided costly frontal assaults while still neutralizing them as threats. The Allies could now focus on continuing their advance toward the Philippines. Following Hollandia, the leapfrogging continued at an even faster pace. Whacked Island was taken in May. Biak Island, with its crucial airfields, was assaulted in late May, though the fighting there proved much tougher than expected and lasted until August. Japanese forces on Biak defended with their usual determination, and the terrain was particularly difficult. Nomfor Island was captured in July. Sansapor was occupied in late July. Each of these operations brought Allied forces closer to the Philippines and extended Allied air cover further along the New Guinea coast. The Japanese forces that had been bypassed faced a slow nightmare. Cut off from supply, they attempted to grow food in the jungle, forage for whatever they could find, and maintain military discipline even as starvation and disease ravaged their ranks. Some units held together remarkably well under these conditions. Others dissolved into scattered groups of desperate men. The Japanese commander, General Hatazo Adachi, tried to maintain offensive capability with his 18th Army even as it starved. In July 1944, he launched an attack against American positions at Adape, hoping to break through and re-establish contact with Japanese forces to the west. The attack, known as the Battle of Dysentery River, involved thousands of Japanese troops in a final desperate offensive. The fighting lasted several weeks and was fierce, but American forces held their positions and eventually drove the Japanese back. The offensive cost the Japanese thousands of men they could not afford to lose and gained them nothing. It was one of the last major Japanese attacks in New Guinea. For the remainder of 1944 and into 1945, these bypassed Japanese forces simply tried to survive. They ate grass, roots, and anything else they could digest. Disease killed more men than combat. Morale collapsed in some units, while others maintained discipline through sheer force of will. Australian forces, taking over garrison duties from American units that moved on to the Philippines, conducted operations to contain these Japanese forces and prevent them from threatening Allied supply lines. The fighting was vicious even though the strategic situation was hopeless for the Japanese. Small unit actions continued in the jungle, sometimes involving just a few men on each side, sometimes entire companies. Japanese soldiers, even in their weakened state, remained dangerous opponents. They would ambush patrols, raid supply dumps, and fight to the death when cornered. Very few surrendered even when faced with certain death from starvation. The Australian operations to clear these remaining Japanese forces continued until the very end of the war, making New Guinea one of the longest continuous campaigns of World War II. Throughout the entire New Guinea campaign, from the first days to the last, disease was a constant and terrible companion. For every man wounded in combat, several more fell victim to malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, dengue fever, or one of the many other tropical diseases that thrived in New Guinea's environment. Malaria was the worst. The mosquitoes that carried the disease were everywhere, and no amount of netting or repellent could keep them all away. Men who contracted malaria suffered violent fevers, chills, and weakness that could last weeks. The disease could recur months or years later. By some estimates, nearly every soldier who served in New Guinea for any extended period contracted malaria at least once. Many had multiple infections. Controlling malaria became as important as any military operation. Medical officers enforced strict rules about taking anti-malarial drugs, wearing protective clothing, and using mosquito netting. Units that didn't follow these rules saw their combat effectiveness drop to nearly zero as men fell sick by the dozens. Tropical ulcers were another scourge. Any minor cut or scratch could become infected in the filthy conditions. Without proper treatment, these infections developed into open sores that ate through skin and muscle down to the bone. Men with severe ulcers had to be evacuated because they could no longer walk or function. Scrub typhus, carried by mites that lived in the jungle undergrowth, caused high fevers and often death. There was no effective treatment during the war. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, left men weak and dehydrated. Fungal infections attacked feet, creating a condition called jungle rot that made every step painful. The combination of these ailments meant that units in New Guinea rarely operated at full strength. Reinforcements arrived and quickly fell victim to disease. Veterans became gaunt shadows of their former selves. Medical evacuation became a constant necessity. Field hospitals struggled to cope with the flood of sick and wounded. Doctors and nurses worked in primitive conditions, often in tents that barely kept out the rain, dealing with wounds and diseases for which they had limited treatments. The dedication of medical personnel saved thousands of lives, but they could not prevent the toll disease took on every unit that fought in New Guinea. For the indigenous peoples of New Guinea, the war brought destruction and change on a scale they could never have imagined. Before the war, most lived in traditional villages, following ways of life that had existed for thousands of years. Some had limited contact with colonial authorities, traders, or missionaries. Others lived in complete isolation from the outside world. The war shattered this isolation forever. Japanese occupation in the northern areas was often brutal. Villages were forced to provide food and labor. Young men were pressed into service as carriers for Japanese troops. Those who resisted or were suspected of helping the Allies faced execution. Entire communities were sometimes massacred. The Japanese, struggling with their own supply problems, took what they needed from native populations without regard for whether those people would starve. This created lasting bitterness and turned many indigenous groups against the Japanese. Allied forces also relied heavily on native assistance, but generally treated local populations better. The famous Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels who carried wounded Australian soldiers down the Kokoda Track became symbols of the cooperation between Allied forces and Papuan peoples. Thousands of New Guineans served as carriers, bringing supplies to forward positions and evacuating wounded men. This work was dangerous and exhausting. Carriers faced the same diseases, the same terrain, and the same enemy fire as soldiers, but with far less equipment and protection. Many died in service. Others were wounded or crippled by the loads they carried over mountain tracks. The payment they received was minimal, but many served willingly, particularly after experiencing Japanese brutality. Some communities provided scouts and guides who led Allied patrols through territory they knew intimately. These scouts saved countless lives by finding paths through the jungle, locating water sources, and warning of Japanese positions. Native warriors in some areas also conducted their own campaigns against Japanese stragglers and small units, seeking revenge for Japanese atrocities. The war brought other changes that would reshape New Guinea society. Thousands of indigenous people saw technology they had never imagined, from aircraft and trucks to radios and modern weapons. They witnessed massive organizations of men and material. They saw Black American soldiers, which challenged colonial racial hierarchies that had placed whites above all others. The cargo cult phenomenon, where some groups believed the material wealth they saw would be delivered to them through spiritual means, emerged in part from the shock of witnessing the massive logistical operations of modern warfare. After the war, many New Guineans who had served with Allied forces expected greater respect and better treatment from colonial authorities. These expectations would eventually contribute to movements for independence that culminated in Papua New Guinea becoming an independent nation in 1975. The war had shown the native peoples that the colonial powers were not invincible, that other ways of organizing society existed, and that they themselves had played a crucial role in determining the outcome of a world conflict. As 1945 began, the strategic focus of the Pacific War had shifted away from New Guinea toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But fighting in New Guinea continued. Australian forces, having taken over from American units, conducted aggressive operations against the remaining Japanese forces. These campaigns were controversial then and remain so now. Some argued that with the Japanese bypassed and isolated, these operations were unnecessary and wasted Australian lives fighting enemies who posed no real threat. Others maintained that allowing Japanese forces to remain unmolested was dangerous, and that offensive action was necessary to protect Allied supply lines and to prevent the Japanese from rebuilding their strength. The Australian command decided to eliminate the Japanese presence systematically. Operations were launched in Bougainville, New Britain, and throughout New Guinea to push the Japanese back and destroy their remaining forces. The fighting was just as brutal as it had been in earlier years. Japanese soldiers, even starving and cut off, defended every position with the same fanatical determination they had shown when victory seemed possible. They launched banzai charges against Australian positions. They fought from caves and bunkers. They refused to surrender even when all hope was gone. Australian troops advanced through the same terrible terrain that had challenged every soldier in New Guinea, fighting an enemy who knew they were defeated but refused to stop fighting. The casualties mounted. Young Australian soldiers died taking positions that had no strategic value, fighting enemies who could have been contained rather than destroyed. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japanese surrender, there were still thousands of Japanese soldiers alive in New Guinea. They had been isolated for over a year, starving and sick, but still armed and still organized. When the surrender came, many could not believe it. Some refused to accept it and had to be convinced by Japanese officers sent specifically to deliver the surrender order. When the fighting finally ended, the cost of the New Guinea campaign became clear, though the full toll would never be completely known. Australian forces suffered approximately 17,000 casualties, including 6,000 killed. American forces lost roughly 13,000 casualties with over 3,000 killed. The Japanese lost at least 130,000 dead, though the actual number was likely much higher. Many Japanese soldiers died from starvation and disease in the jungle, their bodies never found or counted. Entire units vanished into the interior, leaving no record of their fate. The native population suffered casualties that were never accurately recorded, but certainly numbered in the thousands. Some died as carriers or scouts. Others died in Japanese massacres or from disease spread by the large military populations moving through their lands. Villages were destroyed. Food gardens were trampled or seized. Traditional trade routes were disrupted. The social fabric of many communities was torn apart. Beyond the death toll, the campaign left permanent scars on survivors. Men who fought in New Guinea often considered it worse than any other theater of the war. The combination of a determined enemy, hostile terrain, and endemic disease created a level of sustained misery that few other campaigns matched. Veterans returned home with malaria that would recur for years or decades. They carried psychological wounds from witnessing death and suffering on such a massive scale. Many never fully recovered from tropical diseases contracted in the jungle. The native people who survived saw their world irrevocably changed. They could never return to the isolation of pre-war years. They had been drawn into a global conflict and had seen their lands become battlegrounds. The environmental damage was severe in many areas. Bombing, shelling, and the construction of bases and airfields scarred the landscape. Unexploded ordnance remained dangerous for decades after the war ended. The New Guinea Campaign taught important lessons that influenced the rest of the Pacific War and military thinking for years afterward. MacArthur's leapfrogging strategy proved that bypassing enemy strongpoints was more effective than attacking them directly. This approach saved Allied lives and accelerated the pace of advance. The campaign demonstrated the importance of air superiority in jungle warfare. Control of the air allowed the Allies to move supplies and troops effectively while denying the same capability to the Japanese. It showed that traditional European-style warfare had to be adapted drastically for the Pacific environment. The Japanese learned that their initial advantages in experience and training were not enough to overcome superior Allied logistics and industrial production. Their strategy of fighting to the death, while creating determined resistance, ultimately meant that their forces were annihilated rather than preserved for future use. Their refusal to surrender or retreat when the situation was hopeless cost them entire armies that could have been evacuated to fight elsewhere. For Australia, the New Guinea Campaign held special significance. It was the first time since European settlement that Australia faced a direct threat of invasion. The successful defense of Port Moresby and the subsequent offensive operations became a source of national pride and identity. The Kokoda Track, in particular, became sacred ground in Australian military history, comparable to Gallipoli in the First World War. The campaign also highlighted the courage and endurance of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary challenges. Men who had been clerks, farmers, factory workers, and students found themselves fighting in conditions that tested every aspect of their character. Most rose to the challenge, performing acts of courage and sacrifice that became legendary. The bonds formed between soldiers who survived New Guinea together often lasted their entire lives. They had shared an experience so intense that only those who had been there could truly understand it. The New Guinea Campaign also revealed the importance of logistics in modern warfare. Victory went not to the most courageous or skillful warriors, but to the side that could supply its forces effectively. The Allies won in New Guinea primarily because they could deliver food, ammunition, medicine, and reinforcements to their troops, while the Japanese could not. This lesson about the decisive importance of logistics would be reinforced throughout the rest of the war and would influence military planning for decades afterward. Engineers and supply troops, who rarely received recognition, were as essential to victory as the infantry who did the actual fighting. The medical personnel who treated the sick and wounded, the pilots who flew supply missions, the sailors who brought cargo ships to New Guinea ports, and the native carriers who hauled supplies over mountain tracks all played crucial roles in the campaign's outcome. In the years after World War II, the New Guinea Campaign faded from public consciousness in ways that other campaigns did not. The D-Day landings in Normandy, the Battle of Midway, the Siege of Stalingrad, and the atomic bombings of Japan all became iconic moments that everyone knew about. But the New Guinea Campaign, despite its length, its cost, and its strategic importance, became something of a forgotten war. Perhaps the jungle fighting lacked the clear dramatic moments that made other battles memorable. Perhaps the distances involved and the unfamiliar place names made it difficult for people to visualize or understand. Perhaps the grinding nature of the campaign, with its slow advances and constant suffering, didn't fit the narrative of dramatic victories that people preferred to remember. Whatever the reasons, the New Guinea Campaign never captured the popular imagination the way other battles did. Yet for those who fought there, the campaign was unforgettable. Veterans organizations in Australia kept the memory alive through annual commemorations, particularly on Anzac Day, when the Kokoda Track battles were remembered alongside Gallipoli and other famous actions. The track itself became a destination for trekkers who wanted to walk the route that Australian soldiers had defended. Tour groups began following the wartime trail, camping at the sites of old battlefields, and learning about the campaign's history. In Papua New Guinea, the memory of the war remained vivid in communities that had experienced the fighting directly. Old battlefields remained littered with wreckage and debris. Unexploded bombs occasionally killed or injured people who stumbled across them. Stories of the war were passed down through generations, keeping alive the memory of a time when the world's great powers fought across their lands. Museums were established to preserve artifacts and tell the story of the campaign. Memorials were built to honor both the soldiers who fought and the native people who assisted them. Historians gradually came to appreciate the New Guinea Campaign's significance. Books and documentaries explored different aspects of the fighting, bringing the story to new audiences. Researchers uncovered forgotten battles and told the stories of units and individuals whose actions had never been properly recognized. The Japanese perspective, long missing from English language accounts, began to receive attention. Scholars examined how Japanese soldiers experienced the campaign, how their command structure failed them, and how cultural factors influenced their military performance. The experience of the indigenous population also began receiving the attention it deserved. Their role in the campaign and the impact the war had on their societies became subjects of serious study. The concept of the fuzzy-wuzzy angels expanded to encompass a broader understanding of how New Guineans participated in and were affected by the war. The New Guinea Campaign stands as one of the most remarkable military operations of the Second World War, a brutal struggle that tested human endurance in ways few other battles could match. For nearly 3 years, from that first landing in January 1942 to the final surrender in August 1945, soldiers fought through jungles and over mountains in conditions that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. They faced an enemy who refused to surrender, diseases that killed as effectively as bullets, and terrain that was often more dangerous than combat. The campaign began with Japanese victory and advance, reached a turning point on the bloody ridges of the Kokoda Track, and ended with complete Allied triumph and the destruction of Japanese power in the Southwest Pacific. The strategic importance of this victory cannot be overstated. By holding New Guinea, the Allies protected Australia from invasion and created the launching point for the return to the Philippines and the eventual defeat of Japan. The lessons learned in the jungles and mountains of New Guinea influenced military doctrine and strategy for generations.